Hello everyone, welcome to our next training video in the 1 Corinthians series and looking at chapter 14. And just a warning, this is a very long chapter, a very lengthy and complex argument. So just strap yourselves in. This will be a little bit of a longer video, of course, in explaining this. So I'd encourage you read the entire chapter before even getting into the training video, just to get a feel for it. And prayerfully consider what it's saying to us. I think the main message is quite clear. It's more all the details, for example, where we can get lost, where we get lost looking at the trees rather than appreciating the wood. But getting into the passage, remember the context. The context is key here, is this theme that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And of course, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul made a big point about the way of love. And so that's central to how we apply and live the Christian life and use our gifts. They should be, in love, used to build up one another, not in knowledge puff up ourselves. And in chapter 12, verse 31, Paul encouraged the church to eagerly desire the greater gifts. And what we'll see is the greater gifts are those gifts that in love build up the larger church and not ourselves. But he gave a pause, of course, into chapter 13, and we see this theme picked up again. Pursue love, notice love, and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. And notice specifically the gifts that build up the church. Then just some other links to be aware of in chapter 11, and Paul mentions the ideas of praying and prophesying in church, and lo and behold, in chapter 14, Paul's dealing with prophecy and prayer, but particularly praying in tongues. So notice those themes link as well, and that's why we'll even have references to, or the discussion of women in the church as well in chapter 14. And so just keep in mind that when we think about tongues, tongues is actually a form of prayer in the church. More, of course, on that in your notes, but just to clarify, those themes continue. But getting into the passage, understanding the place of tongues is really what verses 2 to 25 is about, and the way of love and gifts. And the basic principle basically is, which Paul states, is those who speak in tongues speaks not to men but to God. So notice the distinction, while those who prophesy speak to people. And whereas the one is directed only to God, those who prophesy actually, the aim is people and it builds them up. It's for their upbuilding. That same term in chapter 8, verse 1. That's the basic principle. And from here on, Paul will basically explore that prophecy is much more appropriate and an application of the way of love than tongues or just praying in tongues in the church, because it builds up. And that's what we're going to see now. Is who is being built up is the next question. And so we notice that tongues, those who pray in tongues, primarily build themselves up, actually, unless it's interpreted. There's a qualification, unless someone interprets it. But repeatedly, Paul points out that those who prophesy or who interpret, speak intelligibly, builds up the church. The church may be built up. And that's why intelligible speech gifts like prophecy, which everyone can understand, or in the interpretation of a language or tongue, is greater, because people can actually understand it, and ultimately it builds others up, not just the individual who is speaking or praying in tongues. And so Paul uses 3 analogies just to emphasize how ridiculous it would be if we had only praying in tongues and no prophecy or interpretation of tongues, that people can actually understand what is being said. So for example, as he says, and he uses 3 analogies. The first one is an instrument. If you have an instrument like a flute, or a harp, a flute or a harp, but you don't give it a distinct note, like praying in tongues, how will anyone know what is being played? Or if you have a bugle and you're calling the battle cry, but it's done indistinctly, not as it should be, who will get ready for battle? The point really is it's chaos. Or as the third analogy would go, I will be a foreigner. I will be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner to me. It's really just a cacophony. In fact, it's a bit like Babel in Genesis 11, where it's just chaos. And that's why he says there, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is being said, for you will be speaking into the air. He's really saying with all three analogies, it is useless. And in love, we should actually be striving to excel in building up the church, not causing confusion. And so from there, a conclusion on those analogies, basically, if you are praying in a tongue, you should actually be praying that someone would interpret it, or there would be the gift of interpretation. Because if you don't, like he mentions at the end, the other person is not being built up. Nobody will know what you're saying. Nobody will be able to say amen to what you're saying. And really what you're doing is you're just puffing yourself up in front of people. You're not really building them up. And that's why, by the way, very importantly, Paul's not saying tongues are wrong or bad. He's just saying, in the context of the larger congregation, thinking about love and applying love to the context of gifts. In the church, he says, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others than 10,000 words in tongues. Really what he's saying is, because of love and what love is, and because we want to build others up, something like praying in tongues in public without interpretation is useless and not building up and actually unloving. It's not that the gift is wrong, it is the application of the gift without love that is wrong. And so Paul gives a final comparison between prophecy and tongues and brings actually in verses 20 to 25 a very interesting dimension. Whereas he points out before that the goal of a church should be to build one another up, he actually highlights in verses 20 to 25 that tongues actually has an eschatological purpose, which is even linked with the Old Testament function of tongues, which is judgment. So he actually quotes for us from Isaiah, by people of a strange tongue and by the lips of foreigners will I speak to this people, and even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. And it's very important to realize he's quoting from Isaiah 28. And when you go read Isaiah 28, you'll see that God is judging Israel. And the one way he judges them is he actually removes the message from them. And it will be spoken with foreign tongues, so they won't understand it and so be unable to repent. And so he's saying, look, tongues is actually a sign of God's judgment on people. And so he points out that tongues are a sign not for believers, because believers need to understand, believe, and be built up, but for unbelievers. While prophecy is a sign not for unbelievers, but for believers. And so he says, when there are outsiders who come in and all speak in tongues, the outsiders or believers enter, will they not say that you are out of your minds? Basically, they won't get the message. It'll just be folly to them. And so like the people of Israel back in Isaiah who were judged by tongues, so actually we are robbing them of hearing and understanding the gospel because they won't understand it if it's spoken in tongues. But he says, but if all prophesy and an unbeliever and outsider enters, he is convicted by all, he is called and account by all, the secrets of his hearts are disclosed because he understands, and so falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. And so, for the sake of the gospel, keep chapter 10, verse 31 to 11:1 in mind. For the sake of the gospel, it's much better to speak intelligibly or prophetically and expound the scriptures and speak to people's hearts that they would understand. It's only then that they will conclude and see how you're speaking to them, and that they will conclude and worship God and say that God is among you. And isn't that the goal of the Christian life? And so again, he's saying it's much better even for unbelievers when you prophesy rather than praying in tongues. And so from here, Paul moves to the church gathering as a whole and makes some general applications. And the general application is quite simple to understand. In verses 26 to 33, really the emphasis is the idea of order. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace or order. And so he notices everything that you do in a church gathering, let all things be done for building up. Nothing should be done that is not building up. And so with these gifts, for example, like praying in tongues, limit the amount of people who do it. And if there's no one who's interpreting these tongues, then it's better just to stay quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. So leave it privately then, because there's no point. Similarly, even with prophecy, even though it's intelligible, there's no point in it happening chaotically. So let 2 or 3 prophets speak. But notice, this is a different form of prophecy. This is not that suddenly we just have to obey what these people say. No, let others weigh what is said. Their prophetic words need to be weighed particularly by those in authority. And so he says the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets. And so the idea here is it must first be weighed whether it is from God or not. And hopefully you can see here's a distinction between prophecy with a small p and prophecy like Moses or the apostles. And so moving from that general application, there's a specific application to women, which links it actually all the way back to chapter 11. And I don't think contextually this is a different audience. It mentions women should keep silent in churches. Of course, this can't mean universal silence, because it says in chapter 11 they pray and prophesy in the church. And it also seems the context here, again, is a marital relationship. Where if there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home. Because in Greco-Roman culture, it was highly inappropriate, and you'll see that in your notes, for a woman or a married woman to go inquire or speak to someone who is not her husband. It is shameful, as Paul says, for a woman to speak in the church. But keep the cultural context of 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16 in mind. It's the same here. And so lastly, just to notice, or just to highlight, is that he brings out that there's a difference between Paul's words and these prophets' words. He says, anyone who thinks he is prophetic or speaks a prophetic word or is a prophet, he should acknowledge that the things I'm writing to you are a command of the Lord. So notice the difference between Paul the apostle and the small p prophets. Small p prophets need to be weighed. Paul's words need to be obeyed as a command from the Lord. And ultimately, in all your services, do all things should be done decently, not shamefully, and in order. And really what you want people to walk away with from this lengthy chapter is to understand the way of love and how it applies to spiritual gifts. And it's really the gifts that should be central in the public gathering of the church are the gifts that build the church up, like singing, like speaking intelligibly, like witnessing, things that people can understand. That the way of love demands it. But also understand why orderliness is essential to our church gatherings. Because like the way of love, if it's chaotic, if everyone just speaks randomly, eventually it's not really building up, it's not really helpful, it's not really accomplishing its goal. But also realize importantly that a church gathering includes inquirers and unbelievers so that they can hear the gospel. It's not exclusivist. Paul has a distinct concern for Greeks and Jews who come into this church gathering to understand the gospel, not to have stumbling blocks to the gospel, and actually believe the gospel. And that is a universal principle that applies even today. Your church gatherings are not for you exclusively, but for the people in your area to come as well. And so you should be concerned about them. And so we should be challenged to apply the way of love and to appreciate order and intelligibility in the service for the sake of believers and unbelievers. And that, I would say, is what 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is all about.